Lord, you are so good to us. Lord, may we learn to practice your goodness, Lord, your faithfulness, and be a blessing to each other, and continue to grow into, Lord, your sons and in your house. May you bless this time. May you bless the young ones' time. And I pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Well, we're moving on to book 13. I'll read the intro, and then I'll have Esther and Naomi read in the 13:1. As in book 12, many of the passages in this book focus on the theme of governing by personal example and the gentle power of virtue, rather than by the means of laws or coercion. The importance of superiors knowing others so that they can employ them fairly and effectively is emphasized, as in the importance of inferiors being forthright and courageous, unafraid to contradict their lord or incur the disfavor of their colleagues. Several passages explicitly contrast the gentleman and petty person, and many others do so implicitly. The gentleman is flexible and context sensitive, while lesser people are rigid and prone both to flattering and being flattered. Related to this theme is a suspicion of public opinion and concern about appearance and actuality, especially the danger of petty people assuming the semblance of virtue. It's very interesting because we were watching the House of David TV show, and just some of the interaction between Saul and the prophet Samuel, and him saying how he was afraid of the people. You know, he was looking for ultimately vainglory, but very driven by the opinions of the people and the outward appearances. You know, even his approval as being selected as king, which was done by casting lots to find the will of the Lord. But they found, you know, this tall, handsome guy, head above shoulders from everyone else, and, you know, seemed to be a very appealing. This is our idea of kingly stature and then capability. When he went in to fight some of the battles and wars, you know, he was a warrior. I guess that's possibly how he labeled himself in certain ways, as a warrior king. And I'm just thinking there's about that, and also the last couple Analects that we've read, basically we're already in kind of embarking on this theme of how a leader chooses a leader in their midst. You need to know the person. That was very, very much the last couple points that we read in chapter 12. And so, you know, it's interesting too to think about this, because everybody would want to say, oh yeah, we want a government that doesn't have laws or coercion, because that would seem very loose and free, you know, very laissez-faire. Everybody can kind of do whatever they want, and yeah, I want to live in that kind of society. I don't remember what it was, but I watched a short documentary one time of this group of people that found some piece of land, I think possibly out in Alaska or something like that, where they could own the land, and then it's basically this open community. So there were literally, the whole point was that it was a community where there were no rules. So, and it was just terrible. Like, I couldn't believe how terrible and nasty this place was. So, like, they were all very strange about the way they went about things, and you ended up with all these eccentric people who don't believe in rules, And then what you find out is that everybody has rules and expectations, and don't know really how to relate to people. And so, and not only that, it's an undeveloped area, so they were all literally living like homeless people and scratching for survival, and ultimately that pitted them against one another. It wasn't a game show, it wasn't a contest show or anything, it was just a documentary of this place. And it just so happened that someone who was doing like a, reporter or something, some sort of writer or whatever, went and stayed there for a couple weeks and interviewed people and whatever else. And it was just appalling how terrible that something that has such a high ideal is. So obviously that's not the ideal here when they're talking about the lack of law or coercion. They're really focusing more on leading by example, and that example being one of self-discipline, self-cultivation.
I think the lack of law and cultivation is by a lack of need, not by a lack of like having. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But I think
it's the coercion. I think that's the heavier part of that, because you're not forcing.
Mm-hmm.
The point isn't that you wouldn't need to. The point is that you shouldn't have to.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, with mankind, that always turns into coercion, and sometimes in the most terrible ways. So, any other thoughts about the introduction? Go ahead, S.
Lou asked about governing. The master replied, "Precede the common people in accepting the burden of labor." When asked to elaborate, he added, "Do not slacken in your efforts."
There are several plausible ways to take Confucius' initial cryptic advice. Taking, Xian,
John.
in the temporal sense
Whatever
of the
Elijah says.
first. Help me with this one name, Elijah.
Don't say no.
What were you? First guide? Where?
What's
Of the first
Kung. Oh.
I don't know. Understands the line to mean first guide the common people by the means of virtue, cause them to have confidence in the you, and then get them to work. As the Book of Changes says, joyful employ the common people, and they will not notice their labors. This accords with 1910, where Xia explains that only once the gentleman has won the common people's confidence, he can put them to work. Mr. Su, on the other hand, takes Xia to mean to take the lead, to set a personal example. When it comes to the behavior of the common people, one must set a personal example, and then the people will put
Put into action.
put into action without having to be ordered. Yu Ye purposes a similar interpretation adopted in the translation above. Although he takes Ixan temporarily, precede the people in accepting the burden of the labor. This seems to best fit the grammar of the sentence and general tenor of the books of 12 and 13, where personal effort directed toward the task of moral cultivation is presented as the key to winning the hearts of the people and governing effectively.
So what's the difference between proceed and precede?
Before and after.
Pro is actually like a present active, right? Proceed is more of a present active.
Oh, you said
Proceed
never
and
mind.
precede.
Sorry. I
But you're
misheard what you
right.
said.
Precede
Yeah.
is do it ahead, right? So don't. I'm just bringing that up to clear your mind on what precede means. It means you are the first example. It means you do it first.
That's precede?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Over here it says like an example, a marching band preceded the float. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
going
Went ahead of.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you could say go ahead of the common people in accepting the burden of labor. Interesting thought. What was the positioning of the ark and the priesthood as Israel traveled?
It was forward.
It preceded them. The priests that carried the ark set out first. Who were the ones who determined the signs and the seasons?
No one said
Priesthood.
precede.
Who were the recipients and administrators of the law of Moses? The priesthood. So God said, I will make you a nation, a kingdom of priests. So governed by a priestly order is what that means. I will make you a kingdom that is governed by priests. That's the literal understanding there. So you can see that in the different formats of government, you have kings or monarchies that are very easily turned toward one or both, which is tyranny, and or in other forms of government it's not so different, but they're like a dictator. So these various formats of government where in essence the practitioners of the way here in this governmental construct for the cultures, the culture that Confucius was promoting, in a sense. I'm not saying that he was proselytizing, because what mostly it's not like he was sending out flyers and doing commercials about his good government. He was really trying to get into the minds and hearts of people to see themselves. So that was, again, interestingly, the course that God took the people of God, Israel, through in the wilderness was to enable them to see something of themselves, what was in their own heart, and then to be able to change. And not necessarily by their own choice, but through an influence or power that was outside of themselves. That's kind of tied into the whole concept of self-cultivation. And so, again, we see some parallels to a divine government, in essence. And a people set apart to be an example to others. That was the appointment that God gave his chosen ones, was to play this role, not to govern over people. I mean, Jesus was very clear about that, and the apostles followed, saying, do not lord over others. Do not think of yourself more highly than you should. Do not think of yourself as better, but rather humble yourself. Those are all very similar principles shared, but not necessarily as bullet points to be followed, but as a more like a model way of life. And a very different approach to how you live your life, how you take on what is considered here the burden of labor. we should not think of labors only as, physical duties. But the burden and labor, Jesus said, what? Come unto me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden. Lay down your burdens. The burdens of what? Was he only talking to the guy that was walking by him with a, load of sticks on his back? No, he was talking about the burdens that we carry in life. And there's a different way to approach those things. Noah and I had Noah, this reminded me, that second statement there of Confucius, do not slacken your efforts, reminded me of bits of our conversation about, loving to learn, and what I had mentioned about being a sluggard, as one who, it's not that they can't, it's just that they don't. And so the encouragement here from Confucius is, don't ever let up. I mean, this is not the way of life that you can just participate in when you want to. Otherwise, it'll have these dramatic effects on those who follow your example or who look to you as an example. And of course, this is all put in the context of not Jaden coming in here and saying, okay, guys, I've really learned a lot. I'm going to be your good example. Follow me. No, it would be that he lives with such passion and conviction that he doesn't even have to say what he's doing in order for it to be observable as a way of life and a certain wisdom put into practice.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that they use this character in here, which is something I could understand. Because it's actually this character is a super commonly used character, like in everyday speech. But it's usually used in the sense of like there's a lot of like 我先, which means I first. And it's used as a preceding word. As like, let me do this first, or I will first, or you first do this. And I mean, it is just a practical way of talking, but it also carries a, right, just like what it's talking about here, kind of a initiative in the word, because you're taking, when you're using it in that way, which is many times used in Chinese language, it's kind of like you're taking the initiative to do something, or you're telling someone else to do that kind of same thing. So.
And how do you say that word?
先.
先.
先. The downward tone.
What's it refer to, taking 先 in the temporal sense of first?
Temporal sense, that's like what I said, because like a sentence could be like 你先去忙, which is like you, literal translation is you go be busy, which is like get back to work, or like, okay, don't, like go do what you were doing, get back to what you were doing. Or 我先 do something, which is like, I'm gonna do this, like I'm gonna do this. But you can say I'm gonna go do this in other ways, but using that word is like you're taking the initiative to do it. You just do it. So it is very applicable to this, when it's talking about being as that mindset as a king to take charge in what you're doing. And being an example to take that initial action.
Yeah, there's two different usages explained here. The first is
Temporal memory.
you go do it. You just do it. You do it first.
Yeah.
and then the other is actually as an example, more of as an example.
Yeah.
So to take the lead. That is, set a personal example.
Something that might be helpful to clarify here is by doing something first or preceding others. He's referring to a willingness and it's more of a presentation of character. I think this encapsulates the summary of this book actually very well, because it's talking about leadership through personal example and, as he calls it, the general power of virtue. I'm reminded of a conversation I overheard like years ago when I was with my friends at Lake Crest, of all places, and they were talking about leadership. It was very interestingly tied in with a lot of conversation during that time about like personality types, and this one guy was thought to be one of the personality types that was usually had an inclination to be a leader, a charismatic person. And interestingly, he was talking about his thoughts on leadership, and he said, I think that a true leader is someone that will only tell others to do things that he is also able to do. Now, before I say anything else, what do you guys think about that? Is that true? Is that wise? A true leader only tells others to do things that he also is able to do.
I don't think that's the way
I think that's impossible.
Any other thoughts? What do you think about that?
So that would mean that a leader, the only reason.
Is that a good precedent, or is that a faulty way of thinking?
I don't think physical capabilities determine a good leader.
That's what I'm about to say.
I think it would be a good leader should only instruct those to do what he would be willing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually brought that to Emmanuel once, and he was like, that's definitely foolish. And he gave me a very interesting example. You know, his examples can be kind of fun. He was talking about like a president and how maybe he'll instruct or give some mandate or encouragement, say, concerning space exploration. The president is very unlikely to have any experience at all in that field, in rocket science, but he still has the place to offer encouragement and initiation, maybe even some advice as far as his capacity enables him to do so in that field or with those people. So as Jaden said, this is definitely more an issue of one's willingness as far as taking on, what does he call it? The burden of labor, which is again not just referring to an ability to do something or engage in a certain activity with skill. It should absolutely be seen as much of anything we look at in this book as a matter of moral or self-cultivation, of an ability, you might say, that every person shares, that every person can cultivate, that every person can, so to speak, activate in himself when it comes to any sort of activity, particularly things that involve communication and relationships with other people. And that's what the leader is really rising as an example of, not in the things that he's able to do, not in the skills he has, not in the abilities he has, because a true leader actually learns to rely on those who have abilities he doesn't have. But where he really rises, you might say, above others, not in a domineering sense, but in the sense of a true leader who bears the mantle of that moral example. It's in his willingness of heart, in his strength, his inner strength, to be the first to bear the burden of you could say initiating what's the best way to put this? It's beyond initiating specific activities. I know you guys are thinking in that direction. And it's more of even just the more impetuous personality type who's always the first to, do something. The first person to raise his hand in class, or the first person to accept a responsibility when it's asked from a group of people. It's more than just that bold personality type. The proceeding and virtuous heart of a true leader, of a ruler, the one who's the first to bear the burden, it's beyond character. It includes character, but it's actually a thing, and this is definitely worth addressing. It's actually a thing bestowed on you. A leader is chosen. All authority flows from the throne of God. And so, in many ways, a leader is not just a type. It's not just a type of personality. It's not just a special character. It's an appointed person. And obviously God will appoint and sustain those who have a willing heart before him and before others that he is responsible for. But when we think of the preceding nature, the first among many quality of a leader, it should be understood not just as a characteristic of a person that they were able to fabricate in themselves, but something that is actually something that is appointed and inspired by God. And a lot of confusion can be caused there as far as rulers that do not rule in a virtuous way. This can be an interesting discussion as far as whether or not they were actually granted authority by God, but the fact that they do have authority, I would argue, means that they have received it from God, whether it is authority that men think they should have or not. So, interestingly, it's the way that we respond to the authority that's been given to us. And of course, I'm not, and neither is this book, simply talking about cases where you have the same kind of influence over the lives and well-being of people as someone like a ruler of an ancient Chinese state would. Because a lot of what Confucius is talking about here is the availability and nearness of this teaching of being able to become a gentleman, or what we could probably better call a righteous man, a righteous person, which is someone who has the heart of a ruler, even though they may not be granted that station in the social world. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to go too much further, but we've been told that even as sons, that same heart is something that the Lord wants to instruct into us, as far as we're willing to be taught it, that of being a head and not a tail in life. And it's going to be very important for us to learn to distinguish that sense of I don't want to say royalty because that sounds too dramatic. The image that I have in my mind that Western Christians are probably most familiar with is that of the four kids in Narnia who serve as a kind of picture of being brought into that same royalty because of their relationship to the king, to Aslan, especially when they're in that other world, I guess representing in some sort of spiritual realm. But the reason I hesitate to use those words is because they're construed in a certain light that may be a little too fantasy-like.
It empowers Christians nowadays to think that they should have whatever they feel like, because
They miss the humility part of it, which is the most essential thing to understand before you.
it's the main key point to that ruling position.
Which is what is so beautiful about a text like this, because it begins at that point. You are a student, and a true student is, well, obviously and foremost, not someone who sets himself above others, especially as teacher.
Yeah, in America though.
Yeah, and that's why it's good to continue to address those ways of thinking that might still be in us, because we have been raised in that.
Yeah.
Usually those things are
Deeply.
are a lot more hidden, and they're below the surface a lot more than we would like to think. But anyways.
Yeah, the idea that position is given or is granted by a higher power is not American either. You know, like you're a self-made man here in America. You build yourself up. You do all the work that it takes. Pull yourself up
That's true.
by the bootstraps, and you make it happen. You know, and if you don't, then you're not gonna make it, because it's a dog-eat-dog world, and you get out there and make it happen. You know, like it's not. Position is not given lightly in America. You have to really work it out and work for it. And
Yeah, and along with that perspective comes this deep set predisposition to democratic thinking. So the equality of every person. And I think that this kind of comparison, person to person, you're no better than I am, you're no more special or valuable than I am, can only come from that another deep set thing that is intricately tied with this perspective of individualism. And the point is not to compare the value of one person to another, or to raise one person in spite of everyone else. That's the only way you can see it, is it's as if it's all a competition, as if it's all the benefiting of one in order to damage or take away from or weaken another. It's like all a battle when you look at it from that point of view. But what if the raising up of one is meant for the benefit of all? That's something that our culture just can't comprehend.
Yeah.
They can't wrap their heads around it. And they, even if they were to agree with that, they would probably not be able to grasp the fact that the person that is raised up, there's actually much about that person that has to be lowered, has to be humbled, that has to be taken from them, that they're actually having to sacrifice, that they're actually a servant of. I mean, it's not an uncommon phrase even in the West to refer to a leader as a servant of the people, but that is so often just like a demagogic phrase. Someone who's trying to steal the hearts of the people. It's a false humility. It's never reflected in the virtue of that person's character.
Or they drive their BMW to go take a vacation on their yacht.
And people have observed that throughout history, and so that phrase actually probably becomes like just foolishness to them. It actually makes them probably
hate it even more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So because people misrepresent a truth, like a leader being a servant of the people, and I know that might not seem right in some senses, because that would perhaps seem to contradict the fact that a leader is ultimately a servant of the Most High God, who is king over all. That's it's not meant to contradict that. And in some functions, a leader is a servant of the people. But that's not considering the people in the democratic sense. Is that kind of making sense? Because
he doesn't just serve the people for their sake.
Serving the people does not mean he's led by, tossed to and fro by the will of the people,
There you go.
which always varies, is never really coherent, and almost always comes from a place of self-preservation, because that is the mind and pursuit of the small man, as it's put in the Analects. But by serving the people, he, and this actually is touched on a little bit in the introduction here, he knows the people. The leader knows the people. And by knowing the people, he's able to bear that burden of labor in such a way that the people are benefited. And when the hearts of the people have been changed, and this is really the apex of the thought in the Analects here, when the hearts of the people have been swayed to virtue, have become virtuous, then the will of the ruler and the will of the people align. And the decisions that the ruler makes is something that the people can rejoice in. That's why the people are able to say, we are so glad that you're leading us to and instructing us and assigning us these different things, because that's what our hearts desire too. But in the beginning stages of a virtuous ruler, there's the raising up of the good and the dispelling of the perverse in the midst of the people. And that can be obviously a very chaotic time. And it actually tends to be such a treacherous time that even if you have a ruler with a virtuous heart, he may not have a courageous enough heart or a wise enough heart to see it through. And even with those good beginnings, things may ultimately shatter.
Yeah.
Because the people are not always going to be happy, even if the best is done for them. But again, the point is not to try to establish that virtue through laws and regulations, but through personal example, through the advice of those who have been raised that have that same vision, that have that same heart of virtue as the ruler does. And eventually, and this is maybe something that even Confucius didn't come to fully realize. Eventually,
Wow.
there is an allowance of the establishment of virtue in the midst of a people, but that's not something that is ultimately achieved by the virtuous ruler. It's by that greater power,
It's that-
which really accomplishes all good things, because only he holds those good things. Only he can truly and even eternally establish that kind of rulership. So it is always an ultimate yielding to that higher way. So maybe Confucius did actually see that a little bit, because he would speak often of the way, a way that some have come to call the Confucian way, but I doubt Confucius ever would have called it that. It was a way that utterly beyond himself and even his thought. And one of my favorite things about Confucius actually is how willing he was to admit his ignorance of spiritual things, because he knew it was beyond his mind, and in some ways beyond his place and beyond his time. But that is really nonetheless what carried his work, his thought, and his passion. Don't forget that he himself said that heaven is what endowed me with what I have. Confucius himself said that. Heaven is this is how he said it? Heaven is the author of the virtue that is in me. Those were his exact words. Translated in English, obviously. But yeah.
I want you guys to look at a few scriptures. Noah, you can go through these. The first is, just write them down first. The first is Matthew 20 through 28. The second is Mark 9, 33 through 37. And then the last is John 15. 18 through 27.
You want me to read those?
Yeah, or have somebody read them. Just for some further context on some of the things you said about being a servant and the different perspectives on leadership, and even some of the things that the disciples struggled with.
So Matthew 20 through 28. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, asked a favor of him. "What is it you want?" he asked. She said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." "You don't know what you're asking," Jesus said to them. "Can you drink the cup I am going to drink?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. There you go. Isaac, do you want to read Mark 9,
Yep.
33 through 37?
They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, What were you arguing about on the road? But they kept quiet, because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last, and the servant of all. He took a little child, whom he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me.
Benji, you can read John.
Mm-hmm. 18 through 27, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the world hates you, keep in mind that they hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, and that is why the world hates you. Remember what I had told you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father as well. If I had not done among them the works no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. As it is, they have seen, and yet they have hated me, both me and my Father. But this is to fulfill what is written in their law. They hated me without reason. When the advocate comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth, who goes out from the Father, he will testify about me. And you also must testify, for you have been with me from the beginning.
Anything to expound there now?
I don't think we understand leadership that well.
You know, just thinking very practically and objectively, the disciples did not think of Jesus' kingdom, his coming kingdom, to be any different than the kingdoms of the world. And, you know, that's a very interesting kind of like parallel here to the way that Confucius describes divine leadership or divinely appointed leadership. His discussions with the leaders throughout the states of China were always in contrast to the typical way. And something that was very similar to, you know, what was a previous one that we read just a couple weeks ago about doing something for your own, for renown, to have a name or to be known as something. And it was a very different than, you know, the way that the different leaders are described. One who is not known, one who is loved and revered, one who is followed, and then one who is despised. You know, followed being by force, and then the one that is despised. And you can see that this is the same construct of leadership that Jesus takes. Now, Noah said earlier, you know, being the servant doesn't mean that you're about doing the will of the people. And clearly that's not what Jesus is talking about either. He's talking about it, and it is in the context of, in his conversation with his own disciples, about what true leadership is. And he was the one that was being the example. And ultimately, in that passage that we read in John, he's kind of giving them the reality of the burden they're going to carry. You know, because this is not going to be well received until something else happens. So we know that history alone has shown us that just having the good principle, an idea like as much of what is written in Confucius writings, is not enough. The recognition of it alone does not equal its fulfillment. And that's why, you know, I wanted to include the last reading in John as well, because without the counselor, the enabler, the one who carries the grace and the power of God to do his will. So that goes beyond one's own ability to cultivate goodness or virtue in yourself. Those things have to be ultimately recognized as from a particular source. And then that has to be yielded to in order for that power to produce in you. So there's a little bit of an additional backing where it's almost like Confucius recognized it, but at the same time there was very little power to put it into practice in the way that it needed to be done so that it could continue to, you know, be what it should be from generation to generation. And so, you know, there are peoples who have carried these principles, but who they are as a nation or who they are as a people are not representative of the very fundamental ideals, principles, philosophies of this understanding. It's not really any different with Christianity either. You know, we have the right foundation and principle given to us, but very few have been able to or come alongside in a full yielding to the Spirit so that those things can be brought out in a living way.
I remember growing up in Christianity, like hearing about the kings of Israel, how they flip-flopped a bunch where it was like one king was good and they would have peace. And then the next king right after him was this horrible guy, and he would like bring all this destruction and people would get taken away, and the next guy, he comes back and there's peace. And for some reason in my mind, growing up in Christianity, like I connected that to like, well, if I just do good and follow after the Lord, then things are going to go well. But then my sin always makes me feel like I'm going to be not following correctly in that way and not able to fulfill. But that totally negates the view of that God has given you that station, right? That's just still kind of in your mind, you're making it like, well, I just have to do better. I just have to try harder to reach a godly way, you know, which obviously we do have to put our effort into it.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I was just thinking about that, the kings of Israel. obviously God put those in there to give us a view of something. The people were very very much missing the point, I think, of God's. And he was always telling them through the prophets too, you know, like, you guys are a wayward people, a stiff-necked people, and always telling them that they were missing it.
Most of the ends that they came to were the ends of their own pursuit, so what they wanted to be or become, and not really ever considering what God wanted them to be or become. But it wasn't for a lack of even, you know, the right understanding and dealing and knowledge that was coming from God, or a lack of communication from God about those things. And the big separation was that the people really never sought out his heart. And so where you see the variations through the period of the kings is you have basically two examples. One was a king is said to be like his father David, who followed in the ways of the Lord, or who sought the Lord. The other is like Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son, who rejected the counsel of God. And so those were the two primary examples. One obviously of sin and rebellion, and the other of a righteous way of life. It's interesting that the comparison is not between Saul and David. It's between David, the household of David, and actually what came from his own household through Solomon. And so Saul was like a half heart, you know. Saul had some good time with the Lord, and as a leader even, but his heart turned. He wasn't wholeheartedly committed to the ways of God, and was drawn away and ultimately rejected. And then Solomon tapered off by, you know, obviously allowing the influences of other cultures to be intermixed with the very sanctified and set apart way that God had ordained and set in place. And so we see the degradation either way. And in David, in the mix, we don't see a perfect man. But in a sense, and this is not in a sinless sense, but we see a man who walked perfectly with God, because he was willing to stay in the light of God's presence, whether that meant judgment and punishment, or victory and blessing. And so his deviations, or you know, where he fell short and did things that were displeasing to God, his desire to stay in the presence of God and in right fellowship with God always enabled him to come back into fellowship with the Lord. So it's already 11 o'clock. What'll you know? Okay, well, we will continue next time. Somebody close our time in prayer. Let the girls be the bookends. S closes.
Father, I thank you for this day today. I thank you that we get to come together as your people and we get to learn about you. Father, I pray that you would open up our hearts and our minds to understand you better. I pray that we would not be afraid to ask questions or want to know more. Father, I thank you for what you are doing in your people. Pray that you would bless each life who is seeking after you with their whole heart. And pray that you would be with us throughout the rest of these classes. And I pray these things in your name. Amen.
Amen.